Hello, everyone. I know you're waiting for this moment. Let us welcome Dr. Dominick. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, of course. So Dominick is an international advisor to a global lay Buddhist movement called Kosei-Kai and a translator of this new translation of Buddhism for today, the essential wisdom of the Lotus Sutra. So this excellent commentary to the threefold Lotus Sutra was published in Japanese by Nikkyo Niwano, the founder of Kosei-Kai, as one book in 1961. And its first English translation was published in 1976, and around a half century later, September 2023, this translation, new translation of Buddhism for today was published, and you are the translator of this book. If you're new to Kosei-Kai, here's the great news. Dominick created a very informative podcast with Arkina called Kosei-Kai in a Nutshell. And let me put a link in the comments so that you can check it out. And also, among other recent publications of yours, you can also check out his articles published in the Dharma World magazine and the Buddhist Christian Studies. Let me also include this information in the comments below. The old translation has 472 pages, while this new translation has 582 pages. So I've got a lot of comments and questions about this book, and it's great that you're here with us today. I'd like to ask you some questions. So when you and I talk and discuss Buddhism for today, the new translation, you oftentimes mention Founder Niwano's religiosity, which seems to be very key to his thought of the Lotus Sutra. There you bring up the theme of the importance of the affective experience, human emotions into a Buddhist practice. Could you say more about that?
Oh, sure. Yes. That was an important concern in translating this book. And I think for any translator, you want, you're standing in between the reader and the original author. As a translator, you're always sort of in the middle. You're this conduit, right? And so I think today we all know that you cannot totally remove yourself. There's no way to sort of not be a factor in influencing the translation. But at the same time, you need to recognize that and work as hard as you can to get the original writer to come through, so that the person on the other side gets a sense of, especially in this case with Nikkyo, a sense of who he was, a sense of, like I say, his religiosity, because I think he has a very interesting and important sort of sense of religiosity, and that's something that I think is also easily misunderstood. So I worked on that a lot. And Founder Niwano's, his sense of religiosity is very much related to some of the underlying metaphors that are in the Lotus Sutra. For example, one of the most important metaphor in the Lotus Sutra, or concept or idea that the Lotus Sutra uses, is familial relationships between parents and children, and not only the inheritance there, right? You inherit, just like you inherit DNA or family characteristics from your parents, we all inherit Buddha nature, right? And there's also that sense that you, in the family relationship, you are both unique but also in a way one with your parents, right? Because essentially you are the two of them put together. So you are them, but at the same time you are yourself too. So the Lotus Sutra is very much expressing these ideas in our relationship with the Buddha and our interaction with the Buddha and our oneness with the Buddha through these ideas of the familial relationship. And so when he explains things, he often uses family interaction and the emotions of family interaction to get people, or to evoke within people, a sense of how it feels to, he calls it true liberation in some cases. In other words, and for him, true liberation, let me give you an example. He will talk about one of the ways he talks about liberation is this idea of a conviction that the Buddha is always with you. You are always together with the Buddha. Right? And the other one he uses very often is this idea of being able to jump into the arms of the Buddha. And this kind of, and sometimes it can throw readers for a loop, it can confuse them. And for example, I would say that, let's say jumping into the arms of the Buddha. What he's trying to do with that metaphor is he's trying to give people a sense of the assurance, the spiritual assurance people have when they take refuge in the Buddha, practice the Buddha's teachings, and start to see the world around them and everything that happens to them as for awakening. That everything that happens in your life is for the purpose of awakening. Whether it be something that we as selfish individuals decide is good or bad based on our own sort of self-interest or our own distorted view of things. The Buddha, the idea is that everything is essentially for the purpose of awakening, right? And that's one of the principal ideas of Lotus Sutra Buddhism, is that essentially, whether it's what we would see as good or bad, it's something that we use in the path. We make it to fuel the stuff of awakening, right?
Right.
The sort of idea that the wisdom or the awakening is in the encounter between two people. And so that when you have that confidence that your everyday life, everything that happens to you is just more fuel for awakening, it's a transformation of your worldview, and you see the world as something that is embracing you. The universe becomes compassionate. And so by talking about this sense of jumping into the arms of the Buddha, what he's really doing is he's trying to get you to think about, for example, when you were maybe worried or concerned or afraid when you were a child, but then your parent was there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a father or a mother. It could be an uncle, it could be a grandfather. That doesn't matter. That guardian figure is there for you. And that feeling of confidence, that feeling of everything is going to be okay, everything is going to work out. In the religious sense, everything is going to work out for awakening. Right? So he's trying to evoke that emotion for us so we can tap into it and we can begin to see the world in that way. Now, for me, I think if you read, I think a lot of his Dharma talks, Dominick talks a lot about being held and carried by his grandfather.
Yes.
And there's a story he tells many times of his grandfather, like in the wintertime, I think it's his grandfather puts him on his shoulders and then takes the overcoat and covers the both of them. Right. And it keeps the both of them warm.
Right. In the cold winter, Niigata.
And that is essentially, he takes those experiences, he sees the parental relationship or guardianship relationship metaphor in the Lotus Sutra, and he brings those two together. Right. And what he's trying to do is, he's trying to do what the Lotus Sutra does, which is use human relationships and emotions for the purpose of awakening. The Lotus Sutra is not about us divorcing ourselves from the normal emotions that we have.
Exactly.
The best example of this that I could give is in chapter 16, where in the verse portion, the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, describes this idea of thirsting for the Buddha. Yearning for sometimes it's translated as yearning, but the actual Sanskrit behind, and you can see this even in the Chinese, katsugo, right? Katsuai is the Chinese, right? The Sino-Japanese. Yes. It's in the Sanskrit. It's Trishna, and Trishna is usually people that are aware of it, it's usually desire, and it's in the 12 causes and conditions as something that's negative.
Right, desire and
It's a
greed.
deluded aspiration for something, right? And you would normally not expect that to be used in a positive way.
Yes.
But chapter 16 is saying is that you take that normal emotion that you have. You're going to have it. You're a human being. You're going to have human emotions. Instead of trying to cut those off or burn them away or cut them out, exert them out, rip them out of your heart, it's saying use them for the purpose of awakening. Right? So what you do is to use that natural human emotion, and some people might consider it a diluted emotion, but you use that normal, average, diluted mind. And what you do is you point it towards the proper object of thirst, which is the Buddha. And then that becomes, so then the diluted mind, the normal human mind, becomes the vehicle for awakening. It drives you to awakening, right? So that's what Founder Niwano is doing when he evokes the memories of these human interactions within the family for us, and tries to get us to carry that over into the way we see the Buddha and the way we see all our experiences and the phenomena around us. So he's trying to use emotion, not to get people to dampen out or separate themselves from or divorce themselves from emotion, but to actually make use of it. And it's the emotion we normally have anyway, right? So in other words, we're using what we already have. What does that do? It makes the path of practice that much easier, makes the vehicle bigger for more people. The other example of a term he often uses is this idea of the Buddha is always together with us.
Oh, yes.
And I would basically advise the readers and the listeners that Nico is not asking you to do some visualization of an Indian fellow standing next to you, who's the Buddha. I mean, it's not something really like that. I don't think we need to read it so literally. But what is the feeling and experience, your being in the world when you have that person you can depend on, that you can trust, that's looking out for you, is standing right next to you, right? Like your father, or maybe let's expand this. Maybe it's a big brother or a big sister, right? That person that gave you the confidence and that gave you the confidence to face the world, right? And so he talks about true liberation. He said this several times. True liberation is the conviction that the Buddha is always together with you, right? And I think what he's talking about, if you want to go back to this sort of doctrinal, technical, philosophical type of language, there's this notion that you will see in the various texts of the Lotus Sutra tradition that when you awaken to the whole world as Buddha nature. That essentially there is no Dharma. There's not a single Dharma. I think exactly the translation should be something like, there is not a single Dharma that is separate from Buddha Dharma. It's something like that. And you see this in all of the older Tiantai texts and Nichiren texts. And so what it's really saying is that, that's a very, this idea, what's a Dharma? It's a phenomenon, right? Or phenomena, right? So, and every phenomena, the cup, the book, everything is essentially an expression of Buddha nature. It is Buddha, right? In the Lotus Sutra sort of approach to Buddhism. That's a very cold sort of philosophical, there is not a single Dharma separate from Buddha Dharma. Well, what does Buddha Dharma mean? Essentially, if it's an existence that's not separate from the Buddha, then it means that this is the Buddha. And the Buddha is right next to me. And the Buddha is right here. And the Buddha is right there. And the Buddha is right there. And the Buddha is right there. So it's that sense of, if I could see the whole world as Buddha nature, as Buddha Dharma, essentially I'm encased, I'm supported, I'm in the hands of Buddha Dharma, or the Buddha. Well, if we sort of think of it in terms of a persona, right? We personalize it, and that imagination that we bring to the subject, it's trying to not convince us that we should think that we're, like I said, always walking through our day with some guy standing next to us, some Indian-looking guy from 2,500 years ago. No, it's not that. It's not that. It's the emotion. It's the way. It's the confidence. It's the way of holding oneself, right? And of course, the linguistically, the Buddha is always with me. It becomes a meme that you can also put in your head and keep in your head and remind yourself. Remind yourself in your daily life, the Buddha is always with me. When you're worried, when you're upset with circumstances, these circumstances are for the purpose of awakening. The Buddha is always with me. And it's a short little teaching that compresses so much of the Lotus Sutra into just a phrase. And you can use that essentially as your eyeglasses through which to correct your vision and see the world as the expression of the Buddha. So these metaphors are critical to his religiosity, and they're very important in Japanese Visha Kosei-Kai practice. And so I wanted to, as best as possible, translate these in a way that people would be accepting and open to those metaphors, because I think a lot of people get interested in Buddhism or moving away from religious traditions where essentially truth is, or the ultimate is personified, right?
I see.
For example, I've heard that when people read or are exposed to the sort of language that Founder Niwana uses, approaching the Buddha, truth as a persona, essentially, right? That it's a theistic approach in many ways for people, and for a lot of people, I think it sort of connects with baggage about thinking about God as a old man with a big white beard in the sky, or something like that. A very a sort of a way of thinking of God as like a person. And so I think a lot of people who come to Buddhism are trying to get away from that. They're not comfortable with that. So I think the first response to some of Niwana Nikkyo's religious metaphors is to respond that, this sounds like Christianity, or this sounds like my tradition that I was born and raised in or exposed to as a child. And I think there's an urge to say, this is like Christianity. That's what I've heard people say. But I think that for the most part, it's not. This idea that there's not a single Dharma that is separate from Buddha Dharma is something that in a lot of modern contemporary Christianity you would not find a statement like that. I mean, you could. The entire world essentially is an expression in many Christian viewpoints of the creation of God, or even the powers or the working of God. Sometimes there are some Christian traditions that will separate out the persona from the sort of the powers of or the essence of God from the powers of the functioning of God. Right?
I see.
And the powers of the functioning of God are something that we have contact with and we can sort of have a communion with. So in that sense, there is an ability in certain views in Christianity to have a sort of oneness with God. But generally speaking, most people haven't grown up in the Christian traditions with that kind of approach. Whereas Buddhism, of course, as Shakyamuni Buddha says in the Lotus Sutra, the goal of the Buddha is to make everyone just like himself.
Right.
Make everyone else a Buddha, equal to me with no difference. That's essentially what the passage says. So there's a sort of, you become equal with the Buddha, you become a Buddha. So people see that as sort of different from the Christian or monotheistic traditions. And so I think sometimes when they see that language, that of the father and the child, it evokes sort of Christian language of, essentially, for example, a Trinitarian language of God the Father. Right? And I think we've got some superficial similarities in the language, but I think that if we understand Nihon Nikko's religiosity and the religiosity of the Lotus Sutra, we're not dealing with something that's, a Christianized version of Buddhism. We're dealing with something very different.
Right.
But everyone can think to a time when they had that experience of the trusted person standing next to them. Or, like I've discussed in a number of articles, one time when I was trick-or-treating as a child, I was chased by a dog, and my father was with me, and I ran as hard, fast as I could, and I just jumped up. My father sort of caught me, and then shooed away the big dog. And that when I'm running towards him, I have to get to my dad, or I'm finished. Looking at the dog behind me. But the Buddhist tradition says that when you practice, you have to be serious. You go, taking refuge, especially in the translations in Chinese and Japanese, means that you return to the Buddha and you basically depend upon the Buddha, right?
Right.
And the desire or the need, the aspiration to practice is often, in many Buddhist texts, is talked about that you have to be as serious as you are when your hair is on fire. When your hair is on fire, you're pretty serious, right? You're pretty serious about putting out that fire. So you have to have that. You have to have that seriousness, right? Right. So that the Buddha is the refuge. We're in the burning house of samsara. Right. The Buddha is the refuge, and if I think about that state of mind I was in when I knew I had to get to my dad, that's how you need to feel about the Buddha Dharma. To be a serious practitioner.
Powerful.
Right? And so these metaphors, so for me, when I looked at that metaphor of jumping into the arms of the Buddha, that's instantly that experience. And I must have been like 4 or 5 years old. But it's one of those foundational experiences in life, right? And so I can almost taste the emotion, right? That's the emotion I need to direct towards the Buddha.
Yeah, rather eliminating, but rather feeling fully and embracing that affective experience is the key to Nikkyo Nirvana thought to liberation.
That's his approach to Buddhism, and it makes it very unique. It makes his religiosity that he brings to how he basically designed Mushoku Sekai and Mushoku Sekai practice, because he brings to it that very unique use of human emotions. It's both a continuation of the Lotus Sutra tradition, but it's also it's opening it up to, I think, a greater number of people. You don't need to have a PhD in philosophy or Buddhist studies or a master's to understand what he's writing in this book. You don't need it. And that's important for today's Buddhism, because you probably have also heard the discussions about Buddhism. Western Buddhism has a race issue, or Western Buddhism has a class issue. Often it tends to appeal to and reach out to educated professionals, people with master's degrees or higher. A lot of times when you go to Dharma centers, that's the kind of people you run into. So where are the people who are not like that? Where is the majority of the society? Right? So we need a vehicle that everyone can get on, not just the educated, not just the philosophically oriented, or not just the people who can bend their knees in lotus or half lotus position for 40 minutes at a time, and sort of enjoy that or appreciate it, because not everyone can do that.
That's right.
Right? So what about the people that can't do that?
Right.
And I think that's one of the great things about the Risho Kosei-Kai approach and about this book, because those metaphors are accessible to anyone, no matter how old you are. If you're 10 years old, or if you're 100 years old.
Right.